Ms. Martinez, this is the White House. The president wants to meet you today. Sarah Martinez nearly dropped the wrench she was holding as the words hit her like a physical blow. 3 days ago, she was just a small-town motorcycle mechanic in Arizona. Now the most powerful person in the world wanted to discuss the 50-year-old documents she'd found hidden inside a Vietnam veteran's Harley-Davidson, documents that were about to expose one of the biggest military cover-ups in American history. The phone call had started simply enough. Ms. Martinez, this is Patricia Collins from the Office of the White House Chief of Staff. I need to speak with you immediately about work you performed yesterday on a 1973 Harley-Davidson Sportster. Sarah's eyes moved instinctively to the empty bay where, just 18 hours ago, she had handed the keys of a fully restored motorcycle back to its owner. The space seemed to echo with the memory of chrome gleaming under fluorescent lights and the satisfied rumble of a perfectly tuned V-twin engine. She had spent 3 months on that bike, working late into the night, sometimes forgetting to eat dinner as she chased the ghost of a mysterious engine knock that had plagued the machine for decades. I'm sorry, but I don't discuss my client's business with Ms. Martinez. The President of the United States would like to meet you today. Can you be in Washington by 3 o'clock? The phone nearly slipped from Sarah's suddenly numb fingers. Through the open bay doors of her garage, she could see the familiar landscape of Millbrook, Arizona, a town of 800 souls where the most exciting thing that had happened in the past 5 years was when the Dairy Queen got a new soft-serve machine. The morning sun painted the desert mountains in shades of rose and amber, and somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed as if this were just another ordinary Tuesday. But nothing about this Tuesday was ordinary. Not the phone call, not the way her heart was hammering against her ribs, and certainly not the reason she suspected she was about to become the center of national attention. "Ma'am, I think you have the wrong person," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. She knew exactly which Harley they were talking about, and she knew exactly why a phone call from the White House shouldn't have been a complete surprise. The motorcycle had belonged to Thomas Eugene Hartley, a Vietnam veteran who had walked into her shop 3 months ago with a machine that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck for 50 miles. The paint was sun-faded and chipped, the chrome was pitted with rust, and the engine knocked like an old diesel truck. But underneath all that neglect, Sarah had recognized the bones of something magnificent, a 1973 Sportster that had rolled off the assembly line in Milwaukee when she was still in diapers. Thomas had been different from her usual customers. Most of the people who brought their bikes to her were weekend warriors with disposable income and shiny new Harleys that needed nothing more than oil changes and tire rotations. Thomas was thin, almost gaunt, with silver hair that stuck up at odd angles and clothes that had been washed so many times the colors had faded to uniform gray. His hands shook slightly when he signed the work order, and Sarah had noticed the way he flinched when a pneumatic tool hissed in the next bay. "This was my brother's bike," he had told her, running his fingers along the cracked leather seat. He bought it right before his second tour. Never got to ride it much after he came home. Sarah had quoted him a price that would barely cover her parts and labor, sensing that even that modest amount would be a stretch for the old man. She had been right. He had paid in cash, counting out wrinkled 20s and 10s with the careful precision of someone who knew the exact value of every dollar. The restoration had been complex, requiring Sarah to work late into many nights dismantling decades of amateur repairs. As she worked, Thomas had taken to visiting the shop in the early mornings, bringing coffee in thermos bottles and sitting quietly in the corner while she worked. He never interrupted or offered unwanted advice, but his presence had become a comforting ritual. Sometimes he would tell her stories about his brother, about the young man who had been drafted at 19 and had returned from Vietnam carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. "Danny used to say that motorcycle was his church," Thomas had said one morning, watching Sarah adjust the carburetor settings with microscopic precision. Said when he was riding, all the noise in his head would go quiet for a while. The breakthrough had come on a Saturday afternoon when Sarah had been working alone in the shop, chasing an electrical gremlin that had been shorting out the ignition system. She had traced wire after wire, checking connections and testing circuits, when she had discovered something that had made her sit back on her heels in stunned silence. Hidden inside the frame, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured with military-grade tape, had been a small metal box. Sarah's first instinct had been to call Thomas immediately, but something had held her back. The weight of the box in her hands had felt significant, important in a way that demanded careful consideration. When she had finally opened it, she had found herself looking at a collection of items that told a story she hadn't expected. There were letters, dozens of them, written in a young man's careful handwriting and addressed to various government officials. There were photographs, some showing a young soldier standing beside the very motorcycle she was restoring, others depicting scenes that Sarah recognized from history books about the Vietnam War. And there had been documents, military records, medical reports, and what appeared to be correspondence from the Department of Veterans Affairs. As she had read through the letters, Sarah had begun to understand that Danny Hartley hadn't just been another casualty of war. He had been a whistleblower, a young soldier who had tried to expose what he believed to be war crimes committed by his unit. The letters detailed atrocities he claimed to have witnessed, naming names and providing specific dates and locations. The responses from various government offices had been polite but dismissive, form letters that thanked him for his service while making it clear that his allegations would not be investigated. The final letter in the collection had been different. It was addressed to a journalist at the Washington Post, written in the same careful handwriting but with an urgency that seemed to leap off the page. In it, Danny Hartley had laid out his evidence in meticulous detail, providing not just accusations but corroborating documentation that he claimed would prove his case. The letter was dated 3 weeks before his death in a motorcycle accident that the police report had ruled a single-vehicle collision caused by excessive speed and alcohol impairment. Sarah had sat in her shop as the desert sun set outside, holding those documents and feeling the weight of history in her hands. She had always been good at fixing things: engines, transmissions, electrical systems. But this was something beyond her expertise. This was something that belonged to the world of politics and justice, realms where a small-town mechanic had no power and no voice. But she had also understood that Thomas deserved to know what his brother had hidden in that motorcycle frame. When she had called him that evening, her voice had been steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Thomas, I need you to come to the shop. I found something in Danny's bike that I think you should see." He had arrived within minutes, as if he had been waiting by the phone. When Sarah had shown him the contents of the metal box, his reaction had been different from what she had expected. Instead of shock or surprise, his face had shown something that looked like relief, as if a burden he had carried for decades was finally being shared. "I always wondered," he had said quietly, holding one of his brother's photographs. "Danny was different after his first tour. Angry all the time, but not at the people you'd expect. He was angry at the government, at the military, at anyone who tried to tell him that what he'd seen over there was normal or necessary." "What do you want to do with this?" Sarah had asked, gesturing to the documents spread across her workbench. Thomas had been quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing the edges of his brother's letters. Danny spent the last year of his life trying to get someone to listen to him. Maybe it's time someone finally did. The conversation that had followed had been unlike anything in Sarah's experience. Thomas had revealed details about his brother's final months that painted a picture of a young man consumed by the need to expose what he believed to be the truth. Danny had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that his phone was tapped and his mail was being intercepted. He had talked about hiding evidence in places where it would be safe until the right time came to reveal it. "He told me once that he'd put everything important somewhere safe," Thomas had said. "Somewhere they'd never think to look. I thought he was just being paranoid, but he wasn't." Sarah had finished. They had agreed that the story needed to be told, but neither of them had known how to begin. Sarah had suggested contacting a journalist, but Thomas had been hesitant. Too many journalists, he said, were more interested in sensationalism than truth. They needed someone who would treat Danny's story with the respect it deserved. In the end, it had been Sarah who had made the decision. She had spent hours researching investigative journalists, reading their previous work, and trying to gauge their integrity. She had finally settled on Maria Santos, a Pulitzer Prize winner known for her careful reporting on military and veterans affairs. The email she had sent had been brief and professional. "I am a motorcycle mechanic in Arizona. While restoring a 1973 Harley-Davidson, I discovered documents that may be relevant to your reporting on Vietnam War-era military conduct. Would you be interested in examining these materials?" The response had come within hours, and by the end of the week, Maria Santos had been sitting in Sarah's garage, photographing documents and taking careful notes, while Thomas shared his memories of his brother's final year. The story had broken 3 days ago, appearing simultaneously in the Washington Post's online edition and as a segment on 60 Minutes. The headline read, "Hidden Evidence: Vietnam Veteran's 50-year-old allegations of war crimes surface in Arizona garage." The impact had been immediate and explosive. Within hours, social media was buzzing with discussions about military accountability and government cover-ups. Veterans groups had issued statements calling for full investigation, while military historians debated the credibility of decades-old allegations. Politicians had been quick to offer soundbites, some calling for justice, while others questioned the timing and motivation behind the revelations. Sarah had tried to stay out of the spotlight, but now the White House was calling. "Ms. Martinez," Patricia Collins continued, "I understand this is sudden, but the President has asked me to arrange a meeting with you today. A car will be sent to pick you up at your shop at noon. Please pack an overnight bag, as you'll be staying in Washington until tomorrow evening." "I don't understand," Sarah said, though part of her did understand. The revelation of Danny Hartley's documents had created a political firestorm, and politicians always wanted to be seen on the right side of stories that captured public attention. "I'm just the person who found the documents. The real story belongs to Thomas and his brother." "The President is very interested in meeting both of you," Patricia Collins said. "Mr. Hartley has already agreed to accompany you to Washington. I believe he's on his way to your shop now." As if summoned by her words, Sarah heard the familiar sound of Thomas's pickup truck pulling into the parking lot outside her garage. The engine knocked slightly. She had been after him for months to let her fix it, and the brakes squealed as he came to a stop. "Ms. Martinez, I know this is overwhelming," Patricia Collins said, her voice softening slightly, "but I want you to understand something. The President doesn't just want to meet you because of the documents you found. He wants to meet you because of what you did after you found them. In a time when many people would have looked the other way or sold the story to the highest bidder, you chose to do the right thing. That matters." Thomas appeared in the doorway of the garage, his silver hair even more disheveled than usual, and his eyes bright with something that looked like excitement mixed with terror. In his hands, he carried a small suitcase that appeared to be older than Sarah herself. "I'll call you back," Sarah said into the phone. "Ms. Martinez, I need an answer now. Can you be ready to leave in 2 hours?" Sarah looked at Thomas, who was standing in the middle of her garage, looking lost and overwhelmed. She thought about Danny Hartley, a young man who had died trying to tell a story that no one wanted to hear. She thought about the motorcycle that had carried his secrets for 50 years, waiting for someone to discover them and give them voice. "We'll be ready," she said. After she hung up the phone, Sarah and Thomas stood in the quiet garage, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal, the ordinariness of the setting, the cluttered workbenches, the calendars from parts suppliers, the coffee-stained paperwork, seemed surreal given what was about to happen. "Are you scared?" Thomas asked. Sarah considered the question. She was scared, but not in the way she might have expected. She wasn't afraid of meeting the President or being in the spotlight. She was afraid of doing justice to Danny Hartley's story, of being worthy of the trust that Thomas had placed in her. "Yeah," she said finally, "but I think that's probably good. If we weren't scared, it would mean this didn't matter." Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since they had discovered his brother's documents. Danny would have been scared too, but he would have gone anyway. As they prepared to leave for Washington, neither Sarah nor Thomas could have imagined how profoundly this day would change not only their lives, but the lives of countless others whose stories had been buried by time and silence. The morning sun climbed higher over the desert, casting sharp shadows across the garage floor where a motorcycle had been restored and a 50-year-old secret had finally found its voice. She could hear the notifications pinging constantly on her phone. Every few minutes, another news outlet requested an interview, another blogger wanted a statement, another social media influencer offered to help her manage her brand through the crisis. She ignored them all, focusing instead on the mundane task of choosing clothes appropriate for meeting the President of the United States. Her wardrobe consisted primarily of work clothes, coveralls, jeans, flannel shirts that had seen better decades. She owned exactly one dress, purchased for her cousin's wedding 3 years ago, and worn only once. It was navy blue with small flowers, conservative and unremarkable, which seemed perfect for the surreal circumstances she found herself in. Growing up as the daughter of Miguel and Carmen Martinez, Sarah had learned early that life was about fixing things that were broken. Her father had been a mechanic at the Ford dealership in Tucson, driving 45 minutes each way to work because the pay was better than anything available in Millbrook. Her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families in Scottsdale, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, her hands cracked and raw from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals. Neither of her parents had finished high school, but they had possessed an almost religious belief in the power of hard work and education. They had saved every penny they could spare to send Sarah to community college, where she had studied automotive technology with the same intensity other students reserved for pre-med courses. She had graduated at the top of her class and had immediately been hired by a Harley-Davidson dealership in Phoenix, where she had quickly gained a reputation as someone who could diagnose problems that stumped other mechanics. The work had suited her temperament perfectly. Engines were logical, predictable systems that responded to careful analysis and skilled intervention. Unlike people, motorcycles didn't lie or hide their problems behind layers of complexity and emotion. When something was wrong, the symptoms were clear, and when you fixed it correctly, the results were immediate and satisfying. But Sarah had also discovered something unexpected during her years at the dealership. She loved the stories that came with the machines. Every motorcycle that rolled into her bay carried the dreams and disappointments of its owner. There were young couples saving for months to buy their first bike together, middle-aged executives trying to recapture their youth, veterans seeking the freedom that only came from the open road. She had been particularly drawn to working on vintage machines, bikes that carried decades of history in their scratched paint and worn leather. These restorations required not just mechanical skill, but a kind of archaeological patience. You had to understand not just how the machine was supposed to work, but how years of modifications and repairs had changed its character. When the dealership had been sold to a corporate chain that cared more about profit margins than craftsmanship, Sarah had made the decision to strike out on her own. She had used her savings to lease the garage in Millbrook, partly because the rent was cheap, but mostly because she craved the simplicity of small-town life. In Millbrook, she wasn't just another employee in a corporate machine. She was Sarah Martinez, the woman who could fix anything with 2 wheels and an engine. The transition hadn't been easy. Small-town mechanics were expected to work on everything from lawnmowers to ATVs, and Sarah had spent her first year learning systems she had never encountered in motorcycle school. She had also struggled with the social dynamics of a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where being a young, unmarried woman in a traditionally male profession sometimes created awkward situations. But gradually she had found her place. Her reputation for honest work and fair prices had spread throughout the region, and she had begun attracting customers from as far away as Tucson and Phoenix. She had also discovered that she genuinely enjoyed the relationships that developed with her regular customers, the easy conversations that happened while they waited for their bikes to be serviced. Her personal life, however, remained largely a mystery to most people in Millbrook. She dated occasionally, usually mechanics or technicians she met at industry events, but she had never found anyone who understood her passion for her work, or who didn't eventually expect her to choose between her career and a relationship. She lived quietly in the apartment above her shop, spending her evenings reading technical manuals and her weekends exploring the desert on her own motorcycle, a 1995 Sportster that she had rebuilt from the ground up. The work on Danny Hartley's motorcycle had been different from any restoration she had previously undertaken. From the moment Thomas had wheeled the machine into her shop, Sarah had sensed that this project carried emotional weight that went far beyond simple mechanical repair. The bike had been neglected for years, but the neglect felt purposeful, as if maintaining it had been too painful for Thomas to contemplate. As she had worked on the Harley, Sarah had found herself thinking constantly about the young man who had originally owned it. The motorcycle bore the modifications typical of a Vietnam-era veteran: a small American flag decal on the fuel tank, aftermarket mirrors positioned for maximum visibility, a horn that was louder than necessary. These weren't the cosmetic modifications of a weekend warrior, but the practical adaptations of someone who had learned to be constantly alert to danger. The physical work of restoration had been meditative in a way that surprised Sarah. Usually, she approached mechanical problems with systematic efficiency, diagnosing issues and implementing solutions with minimal emotional investment. But Danny Hartley's Harley had demanded something different. Each component she cleaned and rebuilt seemed to carry the weight of its owner's story, and Sarah had found herself working with unusual care and reverence. The discovery of the hidden documents had changed everything. In an instant, Sarah had gone from being a mechanic working on an interesting restoration to being the custodian of potentially explosive historical evidence. The weight of that responsibility had been almost overwhelming, keeping her awake at night as she wrestled with questions that had no clear answers. What right did she have to make decisions about Danny Hartley's story? What if the documents were incomplete or misleading? What if revealing them caused more harm than good? What if she was wrong about their significance? The decision to contact Maria Santos had been the most difficult of Sarah's professional life. She had agonized for days, researching the journalist's background and reading her previous articles until she could recite them from memory. Even after making the decision, Sarah had drafted and redrafted her initial email dozens of times, trying to strike the right balance between urgency and caution. When Maria Santos had arrived in Millbrook, Sarah had been struck by the reporter's professionalism and respect for the gravity of the situation. Santos hadn't sensationalized the discovery or pushed for dramatic soundbites. Instead, she had spent hours carefully examining each document, asking detailed questions about their provenance and taking meticulous notes about the context in which they had been found. The decision to publish the story had ultimately been made by Santos and her editors, but Sarah had felt complicit in that choice. She had provided the documents and agreed to be interviewed, understanding that doing so would make her a public figure in a story that was already attracting national attention. The media response had been more intense than Sarah had anticipated. Her phone had started ringing within hours of the story's publication, with reporters from news outlets she had only heard of offering significant sums of money for exclusive interviews. Television news vans had appeared in Millbrook's tiny downtown, their satellite dishes and camera crews creating a circus atmosphere in a town where the biggest previous news story had been the opening of a new gas station. Sarah had tried to maintain her normal routine, arriving at her shop each morning at 7 o'clock and focusing on the motorcycles that needed her attention. But the constant interruptions made concentration difficult, and she found herself jumping every time the phone rang or someone knocked on her door. The most challenging aspect of the sudden fame had been the way it changed her relationships with people in Millbrook. Lifelong neighbors suddenly seemed uncertain about how to interact with her, as if her involvement in a national news story had fundamentally altered her identity. Some people were supportive, stopping by the shop to offer encouragement and praise her for doing the right thing. Others were more skeptical, questioning her motives and wondering aloud why she had chosen to bring unwanted attention to their quiet community. The ambivalence of the responses had forced Sarah to confront questions about her own motivations that she had been trying to avoid. Had she revealed Danny Hartley's documents because she genuinely believed it was the right thing to do, or had she been subconsciously seeking recognition and importance? Was she helping to serve justice, or was she simply feeding her own ego by inserting herself into a story that was much larger than her small-town life? Sarah felt unprepared for the national attention. The call from the White House had been simultaneously validating and terrifying. On one hand, it seemed to confirm that her decision to reveal the documents had been significant and worthwhile. On the other hand, it meant that she was about to be thrust into a political arena where she had no experience and no allies. As she finished packing her suitcase, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror above her dresser. She looked tired, older than her 34 years, with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, hung loose around her shoulders, and she realized that she hadn't taken the time for basic self-care since the story had broken. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who belonged in a garage in rural Arizona, not in the Oval Office of the White House. But perhaps that was exactly why the president wanted to meet her. In a political climate dominated by professional politicians and media personalities, maybe there was value in hearing from someone whose involvement in the story had been accidental and whose motivations were genuinely altruistic. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Thomas standing on her small porch, his suitcase in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. Despite the early hour and the stress of the situation, he looked more alert and energetic than she had seen him in months. "Ready for this?" he asked, offering her the thermos. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that reminded her of countless early mornings in her shop. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this, but I keep thinking about your brother, about how hard he tried to get someone to listen to his story. Maybe this is finally his chance." Thomas nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. Danny always said that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you buried it. He would have been amazed to know that his story would be told by a motorcycle mechanic from Arizona. As they walked together toward Thomas's pickup truck, Sarah realized that her fears about meeting the president were less important than her determination to honor Danny Hartley's memory. Whatever happened in Washington, she would represent not just herself, but a young soldier who had died, trying to expose what he believed to be the truth. The desert morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect visibility that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. Sarah took a deep breath of the familiar air, knowing that by evening she would be breathing different air in a different world, surrounded by people whose lives and motivations she couldn't begin to understand. But she would carry with her the values that had been instilled by her parents and reinforced by years of honest work, integrity, persistence, and the belief that broken things could be fixed if you cared enough to try. The unmarked government sedan that arrived to transport Sarah and Thomas to Washington looked absurdly out of place in the dusty parking lot of Martinez Motorcycle Repair. Its glossy black paint and tinted windows seemed to absorb the desert sunlight, creating an aura of federal authority that made several passers-by stop and stare. The driver, a serious-looking woman in a dark suit, introduced herself simply as Agent Morrison and loaded their luggage with efficient professionalism. As they drove toward Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, Sarah watched the familiar landscape of her childhood roll past the windows. The saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels in the morning light, their arms raised in permanent supplication to the desert sky. She had driven this route hundreds of times, usually to pick up motorcycle parts or attend industry conferences, but today the journey felt like a passage into unknown territory. The first sign that their trip would be different from anything in Sarah's experience came at the airport, where Agent Morrison bypassed the main terminal entirely and drove directly onto the tarmac. A military jet waited beside a hangar, its engines already running and its crew performing final pre-flight checks. "I've never been on a plane," Thomas admitted quietly as they climbed the aircraft's stairs. His voice carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension that reminded Sarah how surreal their situation had become. The flight to Andrews Air Force Base took just over 4 hours, but the time passed quickly as Sarah and Thomas were briefed by a team of White House staffers who had boarded the plane in Phoenix. Patricia Collins, the Chief of Staff's representative who had made the initial phone call, turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. "Before you meet the president," she explained, "I want you to understand the broader context of why this meeting is happening. The documents you discovered have created significant political pressure for the administration. There are calls for congressional investigations, demands for military records to be declassified, and questions about what the government knew and when they knew it." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as the implications of Collins's words sank in. "Are we being brought to Washington as witnesses or as props?" Collins's expression remained neutral, but Sarah detected a flicker of approval in her eyes. "That's a very astute question, Ms. Martinez. The honest answer is that you're both. The president genuinely wants to hear your story and understand how these documents came to light, but he also needs to be seen responding appropriately to allegations that could damage both his administration and the military establishment." The briefing continued with a detailed overview of the media response to the Danny Hartley story. Sarah learned that the initial article and television segment had been followed by dozens of follow-up reports, expert analyses, and opinion pieces. Veterans organizations had issued statements ranging from full support for investigation to skepticism about decades-old allegations. Military historians were debating the credibility of Danny's evidence, while political commentators were using the story to advance their own agendas about government transparency and military accountability. "The challenge," Collins explained, "is that everyone involved in the original events is either dead or very elderly. We can't cross-examine Danny Hartley about his allegations, and most of the officers he named in his letters died years ago. What we have is a collection of documents that may or may not represent the complete truth about what happened in Vietnam 50 years ago." Thomas spoke up for the first time during the briefing. My brother wasn't a liar. He might have been traumatized, he might have been angry, but he didn't make things up. I believe you, Mr. Hartley, Collins replied gently. But belief and legal proof are different things. What the president needs to determine is how to respond to these allegations in a way that honors the service of all veterans while acknowledging the possibility that serious wrongdoing may have occurred. As they approached Washington, Sarah began to appreciate the complexity of the political situation they were entering. The Danny Hartley documents weren't just a historical curiosity. They were a potential catalyst for national conversations about military conduct, government accountability, and the treatment of whistleblowers. The way the president handled this meeting could have implications far beyond the specific allegations Danny had made. Their arrival at Andrews Air Force Base was choreographed with military precision. Another unmarked sedan was waiting on the tarmac, along with a small convoy of support vehicles. Sarah noticed security personnel positioned at strategic points around the area, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. The drive into Washington took them through neighborhoods that Sarah recognized from movies and television shows but had never experienced in person. The capital city's combination of grand monuments and mundane urban sprawl created a disorienting sense of familiarity and foreignness. She found herself thinking about Danny Hartley, wondering if he had ever visited Washington during his attempts to get government officials to investigate his allegations. Their hotel was located in downtown Washington, within walking distance of the White House, but far enough away to avoid the constant presence of protesters and media crews. Sarah was struck by the luxury of her accommodations, a suite with marble bathrooms and Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more per night than she typically spent on groceries in a month. But the opulence felt disconnected from the reason for their visit. As she prepared for dinner with Patricia Collins and other administration officials, Sarah found herself thinking about the contrast between her current surroundings and the modest circumstances of Danny Hartley's life. According to Thomas, his brother had lived in a small apartment and worked a series of low-paying jobs after returning from Vietnam, never accumulating the kind of wealth or influence that might have given his accusations more credibility. The dinner was held in a private dining room at the hotel, with a guest list that included several senior White House staffers, a retired general who served as an advisor on military affairs, and a historian from the Library of Congress who specialized in Vietnam War documentation. Sarah felt outmatched by the credentials and experience of the other attendees, but she was determined to represent Danny Hartley's story with dignity and accuracy. The conversation was initially cordial but gradually became more pointed as the evening progressed. The retired general, a man named Harrison Walsh who had served multiple tours in Vietnam, questioned the reliability of decades-old memories and the possibility that Danny's allegations had been influenced by the psychological trauma of combat. "I'm not questioning this young man's service or his sacrifice," General Walsh said carefully, "but we need to be realistic about the challenges of reconstructing events that happened 50 years ago, based on the recollections of someone who was clearly struggling with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder." Sarah felt her temper rising at the suggestion that Danny's mental health issues invalidated his testimony. With all due respect, General, these weren't just Danny's memories. He provided specific dates, locations, and names. He included photographs and official documents that he had somehow obtained. This wasn't the rambling of someone having flashbacks. This was a systematic attempt to document what he believed to be criminal behavior. The historian, Dr. Rebecca Chen, leaned forward with interest. "Ms. Martinez, have you had the documents authenticated by experts? Questioned their provenance. Papers can be forged, photographs can be manipulated, even official-looking documents can be fabricated." Thomas answered before Sarah could respond. "Dr. Chen, my brother risked his life to get those documents. He died trying to get someone to pay attention to what he was saying. If he was making it all up, why would he have gone to such lengths to hide the evidence? Why would he have spent the last year of his life consumed with getting the story told?" The questions continued throughout the dinner, with each White House official approaching the Danny Hartley documents from a different angle. Some seemed genuinely interested in getting to the truth, while others appeared more concerned with managing the political fallout. Sarah began to understand that their meeting with the president would be carefully orchestrated, with every word and gesture analyzed for its potential impact on public opinion. After dinner, Patricia Collins walked Sarah and Thomas back to their rooms, using the opportunity for a more informal conversation about what they could expect the following day. "The president is going to ask you directly about your motivations for revealing the documents," she warned. "He needs to understand whether you're political actors with an agenda or simply citizens who stumbled into a significant historical discovery." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face Collins directly. "What would it mean if we were political actors? Would that somehow invalidate what Danny Hartley wrote in those letters?" Collins considered the question carefully. "It wouldn't invalidate the documents themselves, but it would change how the administration responds to them. If you're perceived as partisan opponents trying to embarrass the president, then this meeting becomes a damage control exercise. If you're seen as honest citizens doing what they believe is right, then the president has more political cover to order a genuine investigation." The calculation behind Collins's words disturbed Sarah. She realized that the truth or falsehood of Danny's allegations might be less important than the political optics of how the administration handled them. In Washington, it seemed, perception was often more powerful than reality. "Miss Collins," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same directness she used when explaining mechanical problems to customers, "I don't know anything about politics, and I don't care about political parties. I'm here because a young soldier died trying to tell a story that no one wanted to hear, and I happen to be the person who found his evidence 50 years later. If that makes me inconvenient for the president, then maybe he shouldn't have invited me here." Collins smiled for the first time that evening, an expression that seemed genuinely warm rather than professionally polite. "Ms. Martinez, that attitude is exactly why you're here. The president needs to hear from people who aren't calculating the political implications of every word they speak." That night, Sarah lay awake in her luxurious hotel bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened since she had answered her phone that morning. The distance between her small apartment above the garage in Millbrook and this Washington hotel suite felt like more than just geographic miles. It represented a gulf between worlds that operated according to completely different rules and values. She thought about Danny Hartley, wondering what he would have made of the political machinery that was now analyzing and dissecting his accusations. Had he understood during those final months of his life that his story would eventually be filtered through the same governmental systems that had ignored him in the first place? Or had he simply hoped that someday, somehow, someone would care enough about the truth to give his words the serious consideration they deserved? The next morning brought a breakfast meeting with additional administration officials, including the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Sarah was beginning to feel like a specimen under a microscope, with each conversation revealing new layers of complexity in what she had initially viewed as a straightforward moral decision. The Deputy Secretary, a former Marine general named Robert Castellanos, was particularly skeptical of the documents' authenticity and significance. He argued that isolated incidents of misconduct, even if they had occurred, didn't represent systematic problems with military culture or leadership. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in uniform, "I've served in combat zones around the world, and I can tell you that war is inherently chaotic and morally ambiguous. Young soldiers under extreme stress sometimes misinterpret what they see, sometimes exaggerate events, sometimes allow their emotions to color their recollections." Sarah felt her patience wearing thin, with the constant implications that Danny Hartley had been unreliable or delusional. General Castellanos. These weren't heat-of-the-moment observations. Danny spent months documenting what he claimed to have witnessed. He provided names, dates, locations, and supporting evidence. At what point do we stop questioning his credibility and start taking his allegations seriously? The senator, a woman named Elizabeth Moreau who had built her career on veterans' affairs, leaned forward with interest. "Ms. Martinez, what would you say to critics who argue that revealing these documents now, 50 years after the fact, serves no constructive purpose and only damages the reputation of military service members who can no longer defend themselves?" The question struck Sarah as fundamentally wrong-headed. "Senator, with respect, I think that argument gets it backwards. Danny Hartley was a military service member who couldn't defend himself when he was alive. He tried for months to get someone in authority to investigate his allegations, and he was ignored or dismissed. If we don't take his story seriously now, when will we ever take it seriously?" Thomas spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "My brother died believing that his country had betrayed him twice. Once by sending him to fight in a war he didn't understand, and again by refusing to listen when he tried to report what he believed to be war crimes. Maybe it's too late to give Danny justice, but it's not too late to give him the hearing he never got when he was alive. The room fell silent for several moments, and Sarah sensed that Thomas's words had struck something deeper than the political calculations that had dominated most of their conversations. For the first time since arriving in Washington, she felt like they were discussing Danny Hartley as a real person, rather than as a political problem to be managed. Senator Moreau broke the silence. "Mr. Hartley, what would you like to see happen as a result of your brother's documents being revealed?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I'd like someone in authority to actually investigate what Danny claimed to have witnessed. Not to dismiss it because it's old, not to explain it away because he was traumatized, but to seriously examine the evidence and determine whether his allegations have merit. Danny wasn't asking for revenge, he was asking for accountability." The breakfast meeting concluded with promises that the president would give their concerns serious consideration, but Sarah was beginning to understand that presidential attention didn't necessarily translate into meaningful action. The political system seemed designed to absorb controversial revelations and process them through committees and bureaucracies until their impact was diffused and their urgency diminished. As they prepared for their meeting with the president, Sarah found herself thinking about the motorcycle that had started this entire sequence of events. Danny Hartley's 1973 Sportster was probably sitting in Thomas's garage at that moment, its engine running smoothly and its chrome gleaming in the desert sun. The machine that had carried Danny's secrets for 50 years had been restored to perfect working condition, but the story it had hidden was now being subjected to the grinding gears of a political system that seemed more interested in managing controversy than pursuing truth. The White House tour that preceded their meeting with the president felt surreal to Sarah. She walked through rooms where historic decisions had been made, past portraits of leaders who had shaped the course of American history, and tried to reconcile the grandeur of the setting with the modest circumstances of her own life. She was a motorcycle mechanic from rural Arizona, and in a few hours she would be sitting across from the most powerful person in the world, discussing documents she had found hidden in the frame of an old Harley-Davidson. The irony wasn't lost on her that Danny Hartley had spent the final year of his life trying unsuccessfully to get government officials to pay attention to his story, while she had stumbled into their attention almost by accident. The difference, she realized, wasn't in the validity of their respective messages, but in the political climate and media landscape that determined which stories gained traction and which were ignored. As they waited in the West Wing for their meeting to begin, Sarah noticed the careful choreography of presidential politics. Staffers moved with purposeful urgency, their conversations conducted in hushed tones that suggested the weight of the decisions being made around them. Photographers positioned themselves to capture the meeting from the most flattering angles, while communications specialists prepared statements that would frame the president's response to the Danny Hartley revelations. Patricia Collins appeared at Sarah's side, checking her watch and making final adjustments to the schedule. "The president is running about 10 minutes behind, but he's specifically requested extra time for your meeting. He wants to hear your full story without feeling rushed." Sarah appreciated the gesture, but she also wondered how much authentic conversation was possible in a setting where every word would be analyzed for its political implications. She had spent her career solving mechanical problems through direct analysis and practical intervention, but the problem of Danny Hartley's allegations seemed to resist such straightforward approaches. The call finally came for them to enter the Oval Office, and Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as they walked down the hallway toward the most famous room in American politics. She thought about her parents, working-class immigrants who had sacrificed so much to give their daughter opportunities they could never have imagined. She thought about the customers in her shop, ordinary people who trusted her to keep their motorcycles running safely and reliably. And she thought about Danny Hartley, a young soldier whose story had waited 50 years for someone to listen with genuine attention and respect. As the doors to the Oval Office opened, Sarah Martinez stepped across the threshold, carrying with her not just the weight of Danny Hartley's accusations, but the hopes and values of all the people whose lives had been touched by his story. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine not just how history remembered a long-dead veteran's allegations, but how seriously America was willing to confront the uncomfortable truths hidden in its own past. The president stood behind his desk as they entered, his famous smile firmly in place but his eyes showing the fatigue of someone carrying the weight of countless difficult decisions. He moved around the desk to greet them personally, shaking hands with both Sarah and Thomas before gesturing toward the sitting area where their conversation would take place. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Hartley, The president said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a lifetime politician. "Thank you for making the trip to Washington. I've been looking forward to hearing your story firsthand." As they settled into the historic chairs where countless momentous conversations had taken place, Sarah realized that this moment represented both the culmination of Danny Hartley's desperate attempts to be heard and the beginning of whatever justice or accountability might finally be possible for the truths he had died trying to reveal. The Oval Office felt smaller than Sarah had expected, more intimate despite its formal grandeur. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits bearing witness to their conversation. The president had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, a gesture Sarah suspected was calculated to create an atmosphere of informality, but his eyes remained sharp and attentive as he listened to their story. "Mr. Hartley," the president said, turning to Thomas, "I want you to know that I've read every one of your brother's letters, and I've examined the supporting documentation that Ms. Martinez discovered. These are serious allegations, and they deserve serious consideration." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Mr. President, Danny spent the last year of his life trying to get anyone, in government to investigate what he claimed to have witnessed. He wrote letters to senators, congressmen, military officials, even previous presidents. The responses he received were polite but dismissive. Everyone thanked him for his service, but no one was willing to examine his evidence." The president nodded slowly. "I understand that, and I want you to know that this administration takes whistleblower allegations seriously, regardless of when they occurred. But I also need you to understand the challenges we face in investigating events that happened 50 years ago." Sarah felt a familiar surge of frustration at what seemed like another attempt to rationalize inaction. "Mr. President, with respect, those same challenges existed when Danny was alive and trying to get someone to listen to him. The difference is that now his story has captured public attention, which makes it politically necessary to respond." The president's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the sharp intelligence that had carried him to the highest office in the land. "Ms. Martinez, you're absolutely right. The political realities are different now, and I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. But I want you to consider the possibility that political pressure might actually work in favor of getting to the truth." Before Sarah could respond, the president pressed a button on his desk, and Patricia Collins entered the room carrying a thick folder. "What I'm about to share with you hasn't been made public yet," the president continued, "but I wanted you to hear it directly from me, before it becomes part of the official record." Collins handed the folder to the president, who opened it, and spread several documents across the coffee table between them. Sarah recognized some of the items immediately. They were photocopies of Danny Hartley's original letters and supporting materials. But there were also documents she had never seen before, official military records and government correspondence that bore classifications and security markings. 3 days ago, the president explained, I ordered a complete review of all military and intelligence records related to the allegations in your brother's letters. What we found was troubling. Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. You found evidence that Danny was telling the truth? The president chose his words carefully. We found evidence that your brother's allegations were taken more seriously at the time than the official responses would suggest. There are internal memos discussing his claims, investigative reports that were never made public, and correspondence between military officials about how to handle what they called the Hartley problem. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. They knew he was telling the truth, and they covered it up. It's more complicated than that, the president replied. Some officials believed his allegations deserved investigation. Others argued that pursuing them would damage military morale and public support for the war effort. The decision was made to classify the materials and effectively bury the story. Thomas stood up abruptly, his face flushed with an anger that seemed to have been building for 50 years. They let him die thinking he was crazy. They let him die believing that no one cared about what he had witnessed. And all the time, they knew he was telling the truth. The president's voice remained calm, but Sarah could see the weight of the revelation in his expression. Mr. Hartley, I can't change what happened to your brother, and I can't undo 50 years of silence. But I can ensure that his story is finally told with the seriousness and respect it deserves. What followed was the most extraordinary hour of Sarah's life. The president walked them through each of Danny Hartley's specific allegations. showing them the corresponding evidence that military investigators had compiled in secret during the early 1970s. The documentation was extensive and damning. Witness statements from other soldiers, photographic evidence, and official reports that corroborated virtually every claim Danny had made in his letters. The scope of what had been hidden was staggering. Danny's allegations hadn't been the isolated observations of a traumatized young soldier, but part of a pattern of conduct that military officials had identified and documented across multiple units and time periods. The evidence suggested that war crimes had indeed been committed, that they had been reported through proper channels, and that the decision to suppress the investigations had been made at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. "Why are you showing us this now?" Sarah asked. "What's changed that makes it possible to reveal what was hidden for 50 years? The president was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Sarah and Thomas before settling on the documents spread across the table. "What's changed is that most of the people who made the decision to bury these allegations are no longer alive. What's changed is that we have a different understanding now of the importance of accountability and transparency. And what's changed is that you found Danny's hidden evidence and chose to bring it to light." Thomas sank back into his chair, his anger giving way to something that looked like exhaustion mixed with vindication. "Danny always said that the truth would surface eventually. He used to tell me that lies had short legs, but the truth could run forever." The president smiled at the expression. "Your brother sounds like he was a wise man, Mr. Hartley, and he was certainly a brave one." But the revelations weren't finished. Patricia Collins produced another folder, this one containing materials that made Sarah's hands shake as she examined them. There were surveillance reports showing that Danny Hartley had indeed been monitored during the final months of his life, with FBI agents tracking his communications and documenting his attempts to interest journalists in his story. More disturbing still were the accident reports from Danny's fatal motorcycle crash. Sarah's trained eye immediately noticed discrepancies in the police investigation. Skid marks that didn't match the official narrative. Damage patterns that seemed inconsistent with a single vehicle accident. Witness statements that had been dismissed without adequate follow-up. "Onshad, are you saying that Danny was murdered?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow with shock. The president exchanged glances with Patricia Collins before responding. "We're saying that there are enough irregularities in the investigation of your brother's death to warrant reopening the case. The FBI will be conducting a full review of all available evidence." Sarah felt the room spinning around her as the implications sank in. Danny Hartley hadn't just been ignored or dismissed. He had potentially been silenced. The motorcycle that had carried his hidden evidence might also have been the instrument of his death, sabotaged by people who were determined to prevent his story from ever being told. "Ms. Martinez," the president said, his voice gentle but serious, "I need you to understand that by choosing to reveal your brother's documents, you've opened a door that can't be closed again. This story is going to get much bigger and much more complicated before it's finished." Sarah thought about her quiet life in Millbrook, about the simple satisfaction of fixing broken machines and helping her customers keep their motorcycles running. All of that seemed very far away from the political maelstrom she was now sitting in the center of. "Mr. President," she said finally, "I didn't choose any of this. I just found some old documents and decided that they deserve to be taken seriously. If that's opened a door that needed to be opened, then I'm glad I did it." The president stood and moved to the windows overlooking the south lawn, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that Sarah recognized from countless photographs and television appearances. When he turned back to face them, his expression was resolute. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "I'm ordering the establishment of a special commission to investigate all aspects of the allegations contained in Danny Hartley's documents. The commission will have full access to classified materials, subpoena power, and the authority to interview any current or former government officials. Their findings will be made public, regardless of how embarrassing they might be to the military or to previous administrations." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. After 50 years, someone is finally going to listen to what Danny was trying to say. "More than listen," the president replied. "We're going to investigate, and if the evidence supports your brother's allegations, we're going to acknowledge the truth publicly and take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that such failures of accountability never happen again." The meeting continued for another hour, with the president asking detailed questions about how Sarah had discovered the hidden documents and what had motivated her to bring them forward. She found herself speaking more candidly than she had expected, describing her connection to Danny's story and her belief that the truth mattered regardless of its political inconvenience. As they prepared to leave, the president pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that what you did took real courage. It would have been much easier to simply restore that motorcycle and return it to Mr. Hartley without ever opening that hidden compartment." Sarah shook her head. "Mr. President, I don't think it was courage. I think it was just basic decency. When you find evidence that someone died trying to tell an important story, you have a responsibility to make sure that story gets told." The president smiled, and for the first time since entering the Oval Office, Sarah felt like she was talking to a person rather than a political figure. "Ms. Martinez, in my experience, people who do the right thing because it seems like basic decency are exactly the kind of people we need more of in this world." As they left the White House and climbed back into their government sedan, Sarah and Thomas sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything they had learned. The Danny Hartley they had thought they knew, a troubled veteran whose allegations had been ignored, had been replaced by a more complex figure, a whistleblower whose story had been suppressed by a military and political establishment that valued public relations over accountability. The ride back to their hotel took them past the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where tourists and veterans moved slowly along the black granite wall, searching for the names of friends and family members who had died in a war that remained controversial decades after its end. Sarah wondered if Danny Hartley's name was etched into that wall, and whether the people who paused to remember him had any idea of the story he had tried so desperately to tell. That evening, as news of the president's announcement began to break across national media, Sarah found herself at the center of a story that was rapidly evolving beyond anything she could have imagined. The simple act of restoring a vintage motorcycle had uncovered evidence of government cover-ups, potential murder, and institutional failures that reached to the highest levels of American leadership. But as she watched the coverage on the hotel room television, Sarah realized that the most important part of the story wasn't the political scandal or the historical revelations. The most important part was that Danny Hartley, a young soldier who had died trying to be heard, was finally getting the serious attention and respect his allegations had always deserved. The truth, as Thomas had said, could run forever, and after 50 years of silence, Danny Hartley's truth was finally free to run. 6 months after their meeting in the Oval Office, Sarah Martinez stood in the newly dedicated Danny Hartley Memorial Garden at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., watching as Thomas placed a wreath beneath his brother's newly installed commemorative plaque. The ceremony was smaller than the media circus that had surrounded the initial revelations, but the attendees included Vietnam veterans from across the country, family members of other soldiers who had tried to report misconduct, and government officials who had worked on the Special Commission's investigation. The Commission's final report, released just 2 weeks earlier, had validated virtually every allegation in Danny Hartley's hidden documents. More significantly, it had uncovered evidence of systematic suppression of similar reports throughout the Vietnam War, revealing a pattern of institutional failure that extended far beyond Danny's individual case. The report had led to formal apologies from the Department of Defense, new whistleblower protection protocols, and a congressional mandate for regular review of classified materials related to military conduct. But perhaps most importantly for Thomas, the investigation had conclusively determined that Danny's death had not been an accident. FBI analysis of previously overlooked evidence had revealed that his motorcycle had been sabotaged, with brake lines deliberately severed and steering components tampered with. The agents responsible for the surveillance operation had been identified, though most were now deceased. The few surviving operatives had been questioned, and while none admitted direct involvement in Danny's death, their testimony painted a picture of a government willing to use extreme measures to silence inconvenient voices. Sarah had returned to Millbrook after their Washington trip, intending to resume her quiet life as a small-town mechanic, but the story had taken on a life of its own, and she found herself drawn into a world of congressional hearings, media interviews, and advocacy work that she had never sought, but felt obligated to pursue. The garage that had once been her sanctuary became a pilgrimage site for journalists, veterans, and curiosity seekers, who wanted to see the place where Danny Hartley's secrets had finally been revealed. The attention had been overwhelming at first, but Sarah had gradually learned to use her unexpected platform to advocate for veterans' rights and government accountability. She had testified before Congress about the importance of protecting whistleblowers, spoken at veterans, events across the country, and worked with organizations dedicated to uncovering other cases of suppressed military misconduct. The transformation of her life had been profound, but Sarah had insisted on maintaining her connection to the work that had always defined her. She still ran Martinez motorcycle repair, still spent her days with her hands covered in grease, and her attention focused on the mechanical challenges that each broken machine presented. The contrast between her two worlds, celebrity advocate and small-town mechanic, sometimes felt surreal, but it also kept her grounded in the values that had motivated her initial decision to reveal Danny's documents. Thomas had been changed by the experience as well, but in ways that seemed to bring him peace rather than stress. The validation of his brother's story had lifted a burden he had carried for 50 years, replacing doubt and grief with pride and purpose. He had become a fixture at veterans' events, sharing Danny's story and encouraging other veterans to speak up about misconduct they might have witnessed. Danny would have been amazed by all this, Thomas said as they walked together through the memorial garden. He died thinking he was the only one who cared about what he had seen. He never could have imagined that his story would lead to all these changes. Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were complicated. The official recognition and institutional reforms were important, but they couldn't bring back Danny Hartley or undo 50 years of silence. The victory felt incomplete, justice delayed so long that it had lost much of its power to heal. The memorial ceremony included speeches from veterans, advocates, members of the Special Commission, and family members of other soldiers whose stories had been suppressed. Each speaker emphasized themes of courage, accountability, and the importance of protecting those who spoke truth to power. But Sarah found herself thinking about the mechanics of restoration, how some damage could be repaired with enough time and skill, while other damage was permanent, leaving scars that would always be visible. After the ceremony, Sarah and Thomas were approached by Maria Santos, the journalist whose initial reporting had brought Danny's story to national attention. Santos had continued following the story through all its developments, and her book about the case was scheduled for publication the following year. "I wanted to ask you both about something," Santos said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had learned to approach sensitive topics with respect. "I've been contacted by families of other veterans who believe they might have similar stories. Soldiers who tried to report misconduct and were ignored or silenced. They're hoping that Danny's case might have opened a door for their stories to be heard as well." Sarah felt a familiar weight settling on her shoulders. The success of Danny Hartley's story had created expectations that she wasn't sure she was equipped to meet. Other families wanted her to be their advocate, their spokesperson, their connection to the media and political attention that had finally brought justice for Danny. "I'm not an investigator or a journalist," Sarah said. "I'm a mechanic who happened to find some hidden documents. I don't know how much help I can be to other families." Santos smiled understandingly. "Ms. Martinez, I think you're underestimating your impact. What made Danny's story powerful wasn't just the evidence he left behind. It was the fact that an ordinary person chose to take that evidence seriously and bring it forward. Other families don't need you to investigate their cases. They need you to show them that speaking up can make a difference." The conversation continued as they walked back toward the main memorial, with Santos describing some of the other cases that had come to her attention. There were stories from every major military conflict of the past 50 years, soldiers who had tried to report war crimes, cover-ups, and institutional failures, only to be transferred, discharged, or worse. "The Danny Hartley Commission has established new protocols for handling these kinds of allegations," Santos explained. "But protocols are only as good as the people who implement them. What we really need is a cultural change that makes it safe for service members to report misconduct without fear of retaliation." Thomas had been quiet during most of the conversation, but he spoke up as they reached the memorial wall. "Danny used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. Maybe that's what we need to teach people. Not that speaking up is easy, but that it's necessary." As the afternoon sun began to set over the memorial, Sarah found herself thinking about all the names carved into the black granite wall. Each one represented a life cut short, a story that would never be fully told, dreams and potential that had been lost to the violence of war. Danny Hartley's name wasn't on the wall. He had survived Vietnam only to die in Arizona trying to expose what he believed to be the truth about his service. But his story had become part of the larger narrative of sacrifice and service that the memorial represented. The following morning, Sarah and Thomas flew back to Arizona, but their return to Millbrook felt different from their departure 6 months earlier. The town had changed in subtle ways during Sarah's frequent absences, adapting to its unexpected fame as the place where a significant piece of American history had been uncovered. The local diner had added a Danny Hartley Memorial Burger to its menu, and the gas station sold T-shirts that read "Millbrook, where truth rides free." Sarah found the commercialization of Danny's story somewhat uncomfortable, but she also understood that the attention had brought economic benefits to a community that had struggled with declining population and limited opportunities. Several new businesses had opened, attracted by the steady stream of visitors who came to see Martinez motorcycle repair and learn about the discovery that had changed history. The garage itself had been transformed in ways both practical and symbolic. Sarah had installed a small museum area where visitors could learn about Danny Hartley's story and see the motorcycle that had carried his secrets for 50 years. The bike had been returned to Thomas after the FBI completed their investigation, but he had chosen to loan it permanently to the display, believing that it belonged to history rather than to any individual. But the most significant change was less visible. It was the sense of purpose that now infused Sarah's work. Every motorcycle that entered her garage carried the possibility of hidden stories, and she found herself paying attention to details that she might have previously overlooked. The scratches on a fuel tank might indicate a veteran's story. The modifications to a suspension system might reflect adaptations learned in military service. The wear patterns on hand grips might speak to miles ridden in search of peace or understanding. This heightened awareness had led to several smaller discoveries: a Korean War veteran's medal hidden in a seat compartment, love letters from a deployment stashed in a toolkit, a suicide note that arrived just in time to prevent a tragedy. Each finding reinforced Sarah's belief that motorcycles were more than just machines. They were repositories of human experience, carrying the dreams and sorrows of their owners along every mile of highway. The transformation of her perspective had also affected her relationships with her customers. Conversations that had once been limited to mechanical issues now often touched on deeper topics: service experiences, family histories, personal struggles that found expression in the care and modification of cherished machines. Sarah had become not just a mechanic but an inadvertent counselor and historian, helping people preserve and understand the stories embedded in their motorcycles. One particularly meaningful encounter had occurred just 2 months after her return from Washington. An elderly woman named Helen Crawford had brought in a 1967 Triumph Bonneville that had belonged to her late husband, a Vietnam veteran who had died the previous year. The bike had been sitting in her garage for months, and Helen wasn't sure whether to sell it or try to restore it as a memorial. As Sarah had examined the Triumph, she had noticed something familiar: the same careful attention to hidden storage that had characterized Danny Hartley's Harley. A closer inspection had revealed a small compartment welded into the frame, containing letters that Helen's husband had written but never sent to his commanding officers about incidents he had witnessed during his tour of duty. Unlike Danny Hartley, Helen's husband had chosen to keep his concerns to himself, never attempting to report what he had seen. But the letters revealed a conscience that had been troubled for decades, a man who had carried the weight of witnessed injustice throughout his civilian life. Sarah had helped Helen contact the Danny Hartley Commission, which had incorporated her husband's testimony into their broader investigation. The evidence had added another piece to the puzzle of institutional failures and cover-ups that the commission was documenting. More importantly for Helen, it had provided a sense of completion to her husband's story, allowing his concerns to finally be heard and taken seriously. These experiences had convinced Sarah that Danny Hartley's case was not unique. It was simply the first of many stories that would emerge as people gained confidence that their voices could be heard and their evidence would be taken seriously. The commission's work had created a safe space for disclosure, and Sarah's garage had become an unofficial processing center for the physical evidence that supported these revelations. As she reflected on the changes in her life 6 months after finding Danny's documents, Sarah realized that her role had evolved far beyond what she had ever imagined. She was still fundamentally a mechanic, someone who fixed broken things and helped people maintain their machines. But she had also become a guardian of stories, a keeper of secrets that might otherwise remain hidden forever. The responsibility was sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply meaningful. Every motorcycle that left her garage now carried with it not just mechanical improvements, but also the knowledge that its story, whatever that story might be, would be preserved and respected. Thomas had found his own way of honoring his brother's memory. He had established a foundation that provided financial support for veterans who wanted to report misconduct but lacked the resources to pursue their cases through official channels. The foundation also funded research into suppressed military records and supported journalists who specialized in veterans' affairs. Danny always said that the truth was like water. Thomas had told Sarah during one of their regular coffee meetings. No matter how many barriers you put in its way, it will eventually find a path to the surface. I think our job is to help clear away some of those barriers. As the first anniversary of Danny Hartley's story-breaking approached, Sarah found herself preparing for another trip to Washington. The commission was planning a final public ceremony to mark the completion of their investigation, and she had been invited to speak about the importance of preserving and protecting the evidence of historical truth. But before leaving for Washington, Sarah had one more task to complete. Thomas had asked her to perform a full restoration on Danny's motorcycle, returning it to the exact condition it had been in when his brother had first ridden it off the showroom floor in 1973. The work would erase the evidence of decades of neglect and makeshift repairs, but it would also honor the machine's original purpose as a symbol of freedom and possibility. As she worked on the final details of the restoration, Sarah thought about the circular nature of the project. Danny Hartley's Harley had begun as a symbol of hope for a young soldier returning from war. It had become a repository for dangerous secrets, then a forgotten relic gathering dust in a garage. Sarah's initial restoration had brought it back to mechanical life, but the discovery of its hidden contents had given it historical significance that transcended its function as a motorcycle. Now, this final restoration would complete the circle, returning the machine to its essential identity while preserving the memory of everything it had carried through 5 decades of American history. When Sarah started the engine for the final time, the sound would be the same as it had been in 1973, but the meaning would be immeasurably richer. The truth, as Thomas had said, was like water. And Danny Hartley's truth had finally found its way to the surface, carrying with it the power to change not just individual lives, but the institutions and systems that shaped American society. 3 years later, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at Arizona State University, delivering the keynote address at the annual Danny Hartley Symposium on Military Accountability and Government Transparency. The event had become a premier gathering for journalists, veterans, advocates, government officials, and academic researchers who studied the intersection of whistleblowing, institutional accountability, and democratic governance. When I first opened that hidden compartment in Danny Hartley's motorcycle, Sarah told the audience, I thought I was just finding some old papers that belonged to a dead veteran. I had no idea that I was uncovering evidence of systematic failures that had been hidden for 50 years. The symposium had grown from a small gathering of veterans and activists into an internationally recognized conference that attracted participants from around the world. The previous day's sessions had included presentations on cases from Vietnam to Afghanistan, from My Lai to Abu Ghraib, examining patterns of misconduct and cover-up that spanned decades of American military involvement overseas. But Sarah's keynote address focused on something more personal, the transformation that occurred when ordinary citizens chose to take responsibility for preserving and protecting historical truth. She spoke about the mechanics of courage, comparing the restoration of damaged machines to the restoration of damaged institutions. Every motorcycle that comes into my shop tells a story, she explained to the rapt audience. Some stories are simple, a bike that needs new brake pads or an oil change, but others carry deeper narratives, evidence of journeys taken, challenges faced, dreams pursued or abandoned. My job as a mechanic is to understand these stories, to preserve what's worth preserving, and repair what's been broken. In the 3 years since Danny Hartley's story had first broken, Sarah had become one of the most recognizable advocates for government transparency and veterans' rights in America. Her garage in Millbrook had been designated a National Historic Site, and she had established the Hartley Foundation, which provided funding for journalists investigating suppressed military records and legal support for veterans reporting misconduct. The foundation's work had been remarkably successful. In just 3 years, they had helped expose 17 additional cases of suppressed military misconduct, leading to formal investigations, official apologies, and significant changes in military protocols for handling whistleblower complaints. More importantly, they had helped create a cultural shift that made it safer for service members to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. Thomas Hartley, now 78 years old, had become the Foundation's most effective spokesperson. His gentle manner and obvious sincerity had made him a powerful advocate for his brother's legacy, and his testimony before congressional committees had been instrumental in passing new legislation strengthening whistleblower protections for military personnel. Danny always believed that ordinary people could change the world if they had the courage to speak truth to power, Thomas had said during his testimony. What Sarah proved is that sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage come from people who are just trying to do the right thing. The legislative changes had been significant but hard-fought. The Military Accountability and Transparency Act, passed 18 months after the initial revelations, had established new protocols for investigating allegations of misconduct, created independent oversight mechanisms, and provided stronger legal protections for service members who reported wrongdoing. The law had been named the Hartley Act in honor of Danny's sacrifice. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been cultural rather than legal. The story of Danny Hartley and the mechanic who had brought his evidence to light had captured the public imagination in ways that transcended politics and ideology. Veterans across the country had found new courage to share their own stories, and civilians had gained a deeper appreciation for the moral complexities faced by those who served in uniform. Sarah's own life had been transformed in ways both wonderful and challenging. The fame that had come with her role in exposing the Hartley documents had brought opportunities she could never have imagined. Book deals, speaking engagements, consulting opportunities with major corporations and government agencies. She had been featured on magazine covers, profiled in documentaries, and invited to advise presidents and prime ministers on issues of institutional accountability. But success had also brought complications. Her relationship with her hometown of Millbrook had become strained as the constant attention had disrupted the quiet rhythms of small-town life. Some longtime residents resented the transformation of their community into a tourist destination, while others worried that Sarah's growing national profile would eventually lead her to abandon the place that had shaped her values. Sarah had addressed these concerns by making a commitment to keep her primary residence and business in Millbrook, regardless of other opportunities that might arise. She had also worked to ensure that the economic benefits of increased tourism were shared throughout the community, supporting local businesses and funding infrastructure improvements that benefited all residents. The garage itself had been expanded to accommodate both its historical significance and its continuing function as a working motorcycle repair shop. Sarah had hired 2 additional mechanics, both veterans, and had established a training program that taught motorcycle repair skills to other veterans transitioning to civilian careers. The most important thing to understand about what happened with Danny Hartley's story, Sarah continued in her keynote address, is that it wasn't about special expertise or inside connections. It was about ordinary people choosing to pay attention, to care about truth, and to act on their convictions, even when doing so was inconvenient or uncomfortable. 5 years after the symposium, Sarah received a call that would lead to another chapter in the ongoing story of accountability and justice. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the historian who had initially questioned the authenticity of Danny's documents during that first dinner in Washington, had been conducting research in the National Archives when she discovered a cache of previously classified materials that shed new light on the scope of suppressed misconduct reports during the Vietnam era. Sarah, Dr. Chen said over the phone, her voice carrying excitement and concern in equal measure, "I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. The documents I've found suggest that Danny Hartley's case was part of a much larger pattern of suppression that extended far beyond individual incidents." The new documents revealed what amounted to a systematic program of evidence suppression that had operated from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Cases similar to Danny's had been identified and buried across multiple theaters of operation, with evidence suggesting that hundreds of reports of misconduct had been classified and hidden from public view. More disturbing still, the documents indicated that the program had continued well beyond the Vietnam era, with similar suppression mechanisms identified in conflicts from Grenada to Iraq. The institutional failure that had silenced Danny Hartley appeared to be not an aberration, but a standard operating procedure that had been refined and perfected over decades. Sarah found herself once again at the center of a national controversy, but this time she was better prepared for the complexity and intensity of the political response. The Hartley Foundation had grown into a sophisticated organization with legal, research, and communications capabilities that allowed them to pursue investigations with professional rigor while maintaining their commitment to honoring the memory of veterans whose stories had been suppressed. The revelation of the broader suppression program led to the establishment of a permanent Congressional Committee on Military Transparency, chaired by Senator Elizabeth Moreau, who had been deeply affected by her initial meeting with Sarah and Thomas in Washington. The committee was given broad authority to investigate historical cases of suppressed misconduct and to recommend systemic reforms that would prevent future cover-ups. 10 years after first discovering Danny Hartley's hidden documents, Sarah stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as President Maria Santos, the former journalist who had first reported Danny's story, signed the Veterans Truth and Reconciliation Act into law. The legislation established a permanent process for investigating suppressed military records and provided funding for a national memorial honoring veterans who had died trying to expose misconduct. Thomas Hartley, now 83 and walking with a cane, stood beside Sarah as they watched the signing ceremony. His brother's story had become the foundation for a fundamental transformation in how America dealt with uncomfortable truths about its military history. "Danny would have been amazed," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to see justice finally served. He died thinking no one would ever listen to what he had to say. Now his story has changed how the whole country thinks about accountability and truth-telling. The memorial that was dedicated later that year included Danny Hartley's name prominently, among hundreds of other veterans who had attempted to report misconduct and had been ignored, silenced, or worse. The centerpiece of the memorial was a restored 1973 Harley-Davidson Sportster, not Danny's original bike, which remained in the museum at Sarah's garage, but an identical machine that symbolized the power of mechanical restoration to reveal hidden truths. 15 years after the initial discovery, Sarah Martinez was approaching 50, her hair now streaked with gray and her hands bearing the accumulated scars of decades spent working on machinery. She still lived in Millbrook, still operated Martinez motorcycle repair, and still found deep satisfaction in the simple act of fixing broken things and helping them run smoothly again. But her life had also expanded far beyond what she could have imagined as a young mechanic just trying to make a living in a small Arizona town. The Hartley Foundation had become an international organization with offices in 12 countries, investigating suppressed misconduct across military and civilian institutions worldwide. Sarah served as its president, traveling frequently to speak at conferences and advise governments on improving transparency and accountability. The Foundation's work had helped expose corruption and cover-ups from Australia to Germany, from Canada to South Korea. Each investigation built on the lessons learned from Danny Hartley's case, demonstrating that the careful preservation and analysis of historical evidence could lead to meaningful reform, even decades after the original misconduct had occurred. On quiet Sunday mornings in Millbrook, Sarah often rode her own motorcycle through the desert landscapes that had shaped her childhood, thinking about the strange paths that life could take and the unexpected ways that individual choices could ripple outward to affect history. She had set out simply to restore an old Harley-Davidson for a veteran who wanted to honor his brother's memory. That simple act of mechanical care had ultimately helped expose one of the largest cover-ups in American military history and had inspired a global movement toward greater transparency and accountability. 20 years after Danny Hartley's story first broke, Sarah published her memoirs titled The Mechanic's Duty: How Fixing Broken Things Can Change the World. The book became an international bestseller, translated into 37 languages, and was required reading in courses on ethics, journalism, and public policy at universities around the world. In the book's final chapter, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned about the relationship between individual actions and historical change. "I've spent my career fixing motorcycles, and I've learned that every machine, no matter how complex, depends on the proper functioning of its individual components. When one part fails, the entire system can break down. But when each component does its job correctly, the machine can perform feats that seem almost magical, transforming fuel into motion, carrying riders across vast distances, providing freedom and adventure that would be impossible without mechanical precision. I think societies work the same way. They depend on individual citizens performing their roles with integrity and care. When people choose to ignore problems, to look the other way when they see wrongdoing, to prioritize their own comfort over difficult truths, the entire system begins to break down. But when ordinary people choose to pay attention, to care about accuracy and honesty, to act on their convictions even when doing so is difficult or unpopular, then society can achieve things that seem almost miraculous: justice for the forgotten, accountability for the powerful, truth preserved across generations. Danny Hartley was a young soldier who chose to document what he believed to be the truth, even though doing so ultimately cost him his life. Thomas Hartley was a brother who chose to trust a stranger with his family's most precious possession. I was a mechanic who chose to take seriously some old documents hidden in a motorcycle frame. None of us set out to change the world. We were just trying to do the right thing in our own small corners of life. But that's how the world actually changes, not through grand gestures or heroic proclamations, but through the accumulated choices of ordinary people who decide that truth matters more than convenience, that justice matters more than comfort, that the future matters more than the past. Every day, each of us has opportunities to choose between what's easy and what's right, between what's comfortable and what's necessary, between silence and truth. The story of Danny Hartley teaches us that these small choices can echo across decades, that individual acts of courage can inspire institutional change, and that the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, has an almost mechanical persistence. It will keep running until someone finally pays attention to the sound it's making. 25 years after the discovery, Sarah Martinez was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States. The ceremony, held in the East Room of the White House, included Thomas Hartley, now 88 and one of the last surviving veterans of the Vietnam era. In her acceptance speech, Sarah returned once more to the themes that had shaped her understanding of civic responsibility and individual accountability. This medal doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to Danny Hartley, who had the courage to document what he witnessed and the wisdom to preserve evidence for future generations. It belongs to Thomas Hartley, who chose to trust a stranger with his brother's legacy. It belongs to every journalist, investigator, and activist who has worked to bring suppressed stories to light. And it belongs to the countless veterans who have found the courage to speak truth about their experiences, even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. But most of all, this medal belongs to the idea that in a democracy, ordinary citizens have both the right and the responsibility to hold their institutions accountable. We don't have to be experts or insiders to recognize wrongdoing. We don't have to have special credentials to demand honesty from our leaders. We just have to care enough about truth to act when we encounter evidence that needs to be preserved and protected. The story that began in a small garage in Arizona has become a global movement because it reminded people of something they already knew but had perhaps forgotten: that democracy depends on citizens who are willing to do more than just vote, who are willing to pay attention, to ask questions, to insist on accountability, even when it's inconvenient. Danny Hartley died believing that no one would ever listen to what he had to say. Today, his story is taught in schools around the world, his name is carved into memorials in dozens of countries, and his legacy has helped create institutions that protect other whistleblowers from suffering his fate. That transformation didn't happen because of politics or policies. It happened because ordinary people chose to take his story seriously and to act on the belief that truth matters. I hope that 25 years from now, when others are honored for their service to truth and accountability, they will remember that their courage began with a simple choice: the choice to care about things that are bigger than themselves, to preserve stories that need to be told, and to trust that individual actions can indeed change the world. 30 years after the discovery, Sarah Martinez died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 64, still living in the apartment above her garage in Millbrook, Arizona. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people from around the world: veterans, journalists, activists, government officials, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her story. Thomas Hartley, now 93 and the last direct connection to Danny's story, delivered the eulogy. Sarah used to say that she was just a mechanic who happened to find some old documents. But I think she understood better than anyone that there's no such thing as just a mechanic, or just a citizen, or just an ordinary person. There are only people who choose to pay attention and people who choose to look away, people who care about truth and people who are content with convenience. My brother Danny died trying to tell a story that no one wanted to hear. Sarah lived to make sure that story was finally heard by everyone who needed to hear it. Together, they proved that the truth really is like water. No matter how many barriers you put in its way, it will eventually find a path to the surface. Sarah once told me that every motorcycle that came into her garage carried stories that deserve to be preserved and respected. I think the same thing is true about every person who passes through our lives. We all carry stories that matter, evidence of experiences that could help others understand important truths about the world we share. The question is whether we'll have the courage to share those stories when the time comes. and whether we'll have the wisdom to listen when others are trying to share theirs. Sarah showed us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to take seriously the evidence that life places in their hands. Danny's story began with a young soldier's decision to document what he believed to be the truth. It continued with a brother's decision to preserve his memory. It was revealed through a mechanic's decision to take seriously some old documents she found hidden in a motorcycle frame. And it will continue through each of us, as we decide whether to pass on the stories that need to be told and whether to listen to the stories that need to be heard. Sarah understood that fixing broken things isn't just about mechanical repair. It's about restoration of faith, rebuilding of trust, renewal of hope. She spent her life fixing motorcycles, but in the process, she helped fix something much more important. She helped fix our collective willingness to confront difficult truths and to hold our institutions accountable to the values they claim to represent. That's the legacy she leaves us, not just the specific reforms and revelations that grew out of Danny's story, but the example of how individual citizens can take responsibility for preserving and protecting the evidence of historical truth. Every day, each of us has opportunities to choose between what's easy and what's right. Sarah's life reminds us that these choices matter, that individual integrity can inspire institutional change, and that the truth, no matter how long it's been hidden, will always find a way to the surface if there are people willing to help it run free. The Sarah Martinez Institute for Democratic Accountability, established in her honor, continues her work of investigating suppressed evidence and supporting citizens who choose to speak truth to power. The institute operates from a headquarters building in Millbrook, Arizona, just down the street from the garage where Danny Hartley's hidden documents were first discovered. Every year on the anniversary of that discovery, the Institute sponsors the Freedom Ride, a motorcycle rally that brings together veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens from around the world to celebrate the power of individual courage to create lasting change. The ride always begins at Martinez Motorcycle Repair, where Danny's original Harley-Davidson remains on display, and ends at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., where participants place flowers at the Danny Hartley Memorial Garden. The story of the female mechanic who restored a veteran's classic Harley and changed the world has become more than just a historical event. It has become a symbol of the possibility that ordinary people, doing ordinary work with extraordinary integrity, can uncover truths that transform society and inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort, accountability over silence, and justice over convenience. In the end, the most remarkable thing about Sarah Martinez's story may be how unremarkable she insisted it was. She never claimed to be a hero or a crusader, never sought fame or recognition for its own sake. She was simply a person who knew how to fix broken things, and who believed that broken things, whether they were motorcycles or institutions, deserved to be restored to proper working order. That simple philosophy, applied with consistency and courage over 3 decades, helped create a world where Danny Hartley's truth could finally run free, where other suppressed voices could find the courage to speak, and where the mechanical precision of individual integrity could power movements that span generations and continents. The truth, as Thomas Hartley had always said, could run forever. And thanks to a mechanic who chose to pay attention to the stories hidden in the machines she repaired, Danny Hartley's truth will continue running long after all of us are gone, inspiring future generations to choose courage over convenience and accountability over silence. 40 years after Sarah Martinez first opened that hidden compartment in Danny Hartley's motorcycle, her granddaughter Elena Martinez Chen sat in the same garage in Millbrook, Arizona, carefully disassembling a 1969 Honda CB 750 that had been brought to her by the daughter of a Korean War veteran. The motorcycle had belonged to Staff Sergeant Maria Valdez, one of the first Latina women to serve in a combat support role during the final months of the Korean conflict. Elena had inherited more than just her grandmother's mechanical skills. She had also inherited Sarah's instinct for recognizing when a machine carried stories that extended beyond its mechanical function. The Honda showed signs of modification that were inconsistent with civilian use, and Elena had noticed wear patterns that suggested the bike had been used for purposes other than recreational riding. "My mother never talked much about her time in Korea," explained Carmen Valdez Rodriguez, a retired teacher in her 70s who had driven from San Antonio to bring the motorcycle to Elena. "But she loved this bike. She worked on it constantly, always making little adjustments and modifications. Sometimes I'd find her in the garage at midnight, just sitting next to it with a beer, not really working on anything, just being with it. Elena nodded, understanding the deeper connection between veterans and their machines that her grandmother had written about extensively. The Martinez motorcycle repair shop had become something of a pilgrimage site for families who sensed that their loved ones' motorcycles carried hidden stories, and Elena had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect the subtle signs that indicated a machine might contain more than just mechanical components. The Honda CB750 was particularly intriguing because it represented a transitional moment in motorcycle history, the beginning of the Japanese dominance of the motorcycle industry, and the end of an era when American and British manufacturers had ruled the market. But more importantly for Elena's purposes, the bike showed evidence of the kind of careful, purposeful modifications that her grandmother had learned to recognize as potential indicators of hidden storage. As Elena worked on the Honda's engine, she thought about the ways her own life had been shaped by the events that had begun in this same garage 4 decades earlier. She had grown up hearing stories about Danny Hartley and the documents that had changed American history. But for Elena, these weren't distant historical events. They were family stories, part of the foundation that had shaped her understanding of responsibility and integrity. The Martinez family had become guardians of a unique legacy. Elena's mother, Dr. Sofia Martinez Chen, had become a prominent historian specializing in suppressed military records, working closely with the Sarah Martinez Institute to investigate cases of institutional cover-ups around the world. Elena's uncle, Miguel Martinez Jr., had followed his sister Sarah into advocacy work, establishing legal clinics that provided support for whistleblowers in corporate and government settings. But Elena had chosen to return to the mechanical roots of the family's involvement in historical preservation. After earning degrees in both mechanical engineering and archival science, she had taken over operation of the garage from her grandmother, expanding its mission to include systematic documentation and preservation of military motorcycles and their associated stories. The work had revealed patterns that even Sarah had not fully understood during her lifetime. Elena's careful analysis of hundreds of military motorcycles had shown that the practice of hiding documents and evidence in motorcycle frames had been far more common than anyone had previously realized. Veterans from every American conflict since World War II had used their motorcycles as secret archives, preserving evidence of everything from combat experiences to institutional misconduct to personal trauma. The motorcycle became a kind of external memory. Elena had written in her doctoral dissertation on the topic. For veterans who couldn't or wouldn't speak about their experiences, the machine became a repository for the evidence they felt compelled to preserve but were unable to share. Elena's research had led to the establishment of the Veterans Mechanical Memory Project, a systematic effort to document and preserve the stories hidden in military motorcycles across the country. The project worked with families of deceased veterans to examine their motorcycles for hidden compartments, secret storage areas, and other modifications that might contain historical evidence. The project had been remarkably successful, uncovering dozens of significant historical discoveries and hundreds of personal stories that added depth and nuance to the official record of American military involvement overseas. Each discovery was carefully documented, preserved, and when appropriate, shared with relevant historical archives and research institutions. As Elena continued working on Maria Valdez's Honda, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken, a slight irregularity in the frame near the rear shock mount that suggested the presence of a welded compartment. The workmanship was different from what she had seen in Danny Hartley's Harley, more crude and obviously improvised, but the intent appeared to be the same. "Carmen," Elena called to Mrs. Valdez Rodriguez, who was examining the historical displays that now filled one corner of the garage, "I think I've found something that you might want to see." The next hour was spent carefully cutting through the welded seam that had hidden Maria Valdez's secret for over 60 years. Inside the compartment, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in a waterproof container, Elena found a collection of materials that told a story she had never encountered before. There were photographs of what appeared to be a field hospital, showing wounded soldiers being treated by medical personnel who were clearly women, despite official policies that prohibited women from serving in combat zones. There were letters written by Maria to her sister, describing her experiences treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire and her frustration with military policies that denied recognition to women who served in dangerous conditions. Most significantly, there were copies of official reports that Maria had somehow obtained, documenting the heroic actions of female medical personnel who had been denied military decorations because their presence in combat zones was not officially acknowledged. The report showed that women like Maria had saved countless lives while operating under conditions that would have qualified their male counterparts for the highest military honors. Carmen Valdez Rodriguez wept as Elena read excerpts from her mother's letters. "I never knew," she said repeatedly. "I knew she was proud of her service, but I never knew what she had actually done over there." The discovery of Maria Valdez's documents added another chapter to the ongoing story of suppressed military history, but it also represented something new. Evidence of institutional discrimination that went beyond the war crimes and cover-ups that had characterized most previous discoveries. Maria's story revealed systematic gender discrimination that had denied recognition to women who had served with distinction in combat roles. Elena immediately contacted Dr. Rebecca Chen, now in her 80s but still active in historical research, who had become the leading expert on documentation hidden in military vehicles. Dr. Chen's analysis confirmed that Maria's documents were authentic and represented significant new evidence about the role of women in the Korean War. What's remarkable about this discovery, Dr. Chen explained during a video conference with Elena and Carmen, is that it shows how individual veterans created their own historical record when the official record failed to acknowledge their contributions. Maria Valdez knew that her service was significant, and she took steps to preserve evidence of that service even though she had no way of knowing whether anyone would ever see it. The revelation of Maria Valdez's story created renewed interest in the experiences of women veterans, leading to a congressional investigation into the systematic denial of recognition to female military personnel who had served in combat roles. The investigation revealed that hundreds of women had been denied decorations and recognition because military policies had officially prohibited their presence in the combat zones where they had actually served with distinction. But for Elena, the most meaningful aspect of the discovery was the way it connected her personally to the ongoing work of historical preservation that her grandmother had begun. Each motorcycle that entered the garage carried the potential for revelation, and each discovery added to the growing understanding of how individual Americans had experienced and documented the major conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries. The success of the Veterans Mechanical Memory Project had attracted international attention, and Elena found herself consulting with researchers and institutions around the world who were discovering similar patterns of hidden documentation in military vehicles from other countries. Veterans in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Germany had also used their motorcycles as secret archives, preserving evidence of experiences that official histories had overlooked or suppressed. "What we're seeing," Elena explained during a presentation at the International Conference on Hidden Histories, "is a global phenomenon of individual documentation that occurred parallel to official record-keeping." Veterans who felt that their experiences were not being accurately recorded by institutional authorities took it upon themselves to preserve evidence for future generations. The work had also revealed troubling patterns of institutional failure that extended far beyond individual cases of suppressed evidence. Elena's analysis of hundreds of hidden documents had shown that military and government institutions had consistently failed to provide adequate channels for reporting misconduct, documenting heroism, or preserving the experiences of marginalized service members. The fact that so many veterans felt compelled to hide evidence in their motorcycles suggests a fundamental breakdown in institutional trust. Elena had written in a report for the Department of Defense. These weren't isolated cases of individual paranoia. They represent a systematic failure to create safe and effective channels for preserving and sharing important historical information. Elena's work had led to significant reforms in military record-keeping and documentation practices. The Department of Defense had established new protocols for preserving the experiences of all service members, including those whose stories might not fit traditional narratives of military service. The Veterans Administration had created programs specifically designed to encourage veterans to share their experiences and ensure that those experiences were properly documented and preserved. But perhaps the most important impact of Elena's work was cultural rather than institutional. The story of the mechanic's granddaughter who continued her grandmother's work had captured public imagination in ways that reminded people of the ongoing importance of individual responsibility for historical preservation. Elena had written extensively about the philosophical implications of her discoveries, exploring questions about the relationship between individual memory and institutional history. the role of material objects in preserving human experience, and the responsibility of each generation to preserve and protect the stories of those who came before. Every motorcycle that enters this garage reminds me that history isn't just what's written in textbooks or preserved in official archives. Elena had written in her memoir, published on the 40th anniversary of Danny Hartley's story. History is also what people choose to preserve and protect in the private spaces of their lives, the evidence they hide away because they believe it's important even when no one else seems to care. Elena's memoir, titled The Mechanic's Inheritance, 4 Decades of Hidden Truths, had become required reading in courses on historical methodology, archival science, and veterans' studies. The book explored not just the specific discoveries that had been made in the garage, but the broader implications of finding so much suppressed evidence in such an unlikely place. My grandmother used to say that every machine tells a story if you know how to listen, Elena had written. What I've learned is that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that machines have been modified to hide. The act of concealing evidence in a motorcycle frame represents both desperation and hope. Desperation that official channels will never provide justice or recognition, but hope that someday someone will care enough to look carefully and take seriously what they find. The 40th anniversary of Danny Hartley's story was marked by an international symposium held in Millbrook, Arizona, bringing together researchers, veterans, advocates, and government officials from around the world. The symposium included presentations on hidden histories from dozens of countries, demonstrating that the pattern first identified in Danny's Harley had global implications for understanding how individuals preserve evidence when institutions fail them. Elena served as the symposium's keynote speaker, delivering an address that built on her grandmother's legacy while pointing toward future challenges and opportunities in the field of historical preservation. 40 years ago, my grandmother opened a hidden compartment in a veteran's motorcycle and found evidence that changed American history, Elena told the assembled audience. What we've learned since then is that her discovery was not unique. It was representative of a global phenomenon of individual historical preservation that has been happening parallel to official record-keeping for decades. Elena's speech outlined the scope of discoveries that had been made through the Veterans Mechanical Memory Project and similar efforts around the world. In 4 decades of systematic investigation, researchers had found evidence of suppressed war crimes, unrecognized heroism, institutional discrimination, and personal trauma hidden in thousands of military vehicles. But perhaps the most important thing we've learned, Elena continued, is that the act of preserving evidence, even when you have no guarantee that anyone will ever see it, is itself a form of resistance to institutional failure and a testament to the human belief that truth ultimately matters more than convenience. The symposium also marked the launch of the Elena Martinez Digital Archive, a comprehensive online repository of all the documents and stories that had been discovered through the Mechanical Memory Project. The archive was designed to ensure that the evidence preserved by individual veterans would be accessible to researchers, family members, and interested citizens for generations to come. Technology has given us tools that my grandmother could never have imagined, Elena explained during the archive's launch presentation. We can now preserve and share these hidden stories in ways that ensure they will never again be lost or suppressed. Every document, every photograph, every letter that we've found hidden in a motorcycle frame can now be accessed by anyone who wants to understand the full complexity of American military history. The digital archive had already attracted millions of visitors from around the world, with researchers using its contents to write new histories, family members discovering previously unknown stories about their relatives, and educators incorporating its materials into curricula that provided more complete and nuanced understandings of military service and its consequences. But even as Elena celebrated the technological advances that made global preservation and sharing possible, she remained committed to the hands-on, mechanical work that had defined her family's contribution to historical preservation. Every day, she still spent hours in the garage, working on motorcycles with her hands, listening for the subtle signs that indicated hidden stories waiting to be discovered. There's something about working with your hands that can't be replaced by digital technology, Elena reflected during an interview with a documentary filmmaker who was creating a retrospective about the Martinez family's work. When you're disassembling a motorcycle, feeling the weight of each component, understanding how each system connects to every other system, you develop an intuitive sense of what belongs and what doesn't. That intuition is what allowed my grandmother to notice the hidden compartment in Danny Hartley's bike, and it's what continues to guide my work today. Elena's commitment to combining traditional mechanical skills with modern preservation techniques had inspired a new generation of researchers and advocates who understood that historical preservation required both technological sophistication and hands-on craftsmanship. The Sarah Martinez Institute had established training programs that taught archival science alongside motorcycle repair, creating a new profession of mechanical historians who could identify and preserve evidence hidden in material objects. As Elena approached her 50th birthday, she began planning for the next phase of the Veterans Mechanical Memory Project. Her daughter, Dr. Sarah Elena Martinez Nakamura, was completing her residency in psychiatry and had expressed interest in studying the psychological aspects of evidence preservation among trauma survivors. Elena's son, Daniel Thomas Martinez, was finishing his degree in computer science and artificial intelligence, with plans to develop technological tools that could help identify hidden compartments in vehicles more efficiently. Each generation builds on the work of the previous generation, Elena explained to her children during a family dinner in the apartment above the garage where their great-grandmother had lived. Grandma Sarah discovered that motorcycles could hide important stories. I've shown that this pattern exists globally and historically. Your job will be to figure out how to preserve and protect these stories for the next generation. The conversation took place in the same kitchen where Sarah Martinez had first struggled with the decision to reveal Danny Hartley's documents, and Elena was conscious of the weight of family tradition and responsibility that surrounded them. The simple apartment had become a pilgrimage site for people from around the world who wanted to understand how individual choices in ordinary places could create extraordinary historical change. Sometimes I think about how different our lives would have been if Grandma Sarah had just returned that motorcycle to Thomas without opening the hidden compartment, Elena said to her children. But then I remember that she was the kind of person who paid attention to details, who cared about doing things right, who couldn't ignore evidence just because it was inconvenient. Those weren't accidental choices. They were expressions of who she was and what she believed about responsibility and integrity. The family dinner conversation turned to the future of the work that had begun with Danny Hartley's hidden documents. Elena's children were preparing to carry the legacy into new domains: psychological understanding of why people preserve evidence, technological tools for identifying hidden compartments, and global networks for sharing discoveries across international boundaries. What I hope you'll remember, Elena told her children, is that this work isn't really about motorcycles or hidden documents or even historical preservation. It's about the belief that individual people matter, that their stories deserve to be heard and respected, and that ordinary citizens have both the right and the responsibility to preserve truth even when institutions fail them. As Elena looked around the table at her family, she saw the continuation of values and commitments that had been passed down through 3 generations of Martinez women. Each generation had found their own way of expressing those values. Sarah through mechanical work and advocacy, Elena through systematic research and preservation, and now her children through psychology and technology. But underneath the different approaches was a consistent commitment to the idea that individuals could make a difference, that paying attention to detail mattered, and that truth had a mechanical persistence that would eventually overcome any efforts to suppress or ignore it. The legacy of Danny Hartley's hidden documents had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined when Sarah Martinez first opened that secret compartment in 1973. What had begun as a simple motorcycle restoration had evolved into a global movement for transparency and accountability, a new field of mechanical historical preservation, and a family tradition of service to truth and justice. But at its heart, the story remained what it had always been, a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they choose to pay attention, to care about accuracy and honesty, and to act on their convictions even when doing so requires courage and sacrifice. Elena Martinez Chen, granddaughter of a small-town mechanic, had inherited more than just a garage and a family business. She had inherited a responsibility to listen carefully to the stories that machines could tell, to preserve evidence that others might overlook, and to ensure that the voices of forgotten people would continue to be heard by future generations. As she prepared for bed in the apartment above the garage where her grandmother had lived and worked, Elena could hear the desert wind moving through the saguaro cacti outside, the same sound that had surrounded her grandmother during all those late nights spent working on motorcycles and wrestling with questions about truth and responsibility. The sound reminded Elena that some things endured across generations: the landscape of the desert, the persistence of truth, and the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when they believed that their actions mattered. Those constants provided stability and direction in a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. Tomorrow would bring new motorcycles to examine, new stories to discover, and new evidence to preserve. Elena would approach each machine with the same careful attention that her grandmother had brought to Danny Hartley's Harley-Davidson, listening for the subtle signs that indicated hidden stories waiting to be revealed. The truth, as Thomas Hartley had always said, could run forever. And thanks to 3 generations of mechanics who had chosen to pay attention to the stories hidden in the machines they repaired, Danny Hartley's truth, and the truths of hundreds of other forgotten veterans, would continue running long after all of them were gone, inspiring future generations to choose courage over convenience and accountability over silence. On Chin, this medal doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to Danny Hartley, who had the courage to document what he witnessed and the wisdom to preserve evidence for future generations. It belongs to Thomas Hartley, who chose to trust a stranger with his brother's legacy. It belongs to every journalist, investigator, and activist who has worked to bring suppressed stories to light. And it belongs to the countless veterans who have found the courage to speak truth about their experiences, even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. But most of all, this medal belongs to the idea that in a democracy, ordinary citizens have both the right and the responsibility to hold their institutions accountable. We don't have to be experts or insiders to recognize wrongdoing. We don't have to have special credentials to demand honesty from our leaders. We just have to care enough about truth to act when we encounter evidence that needs to be preserved and protected. The story that began in a small garage in Arizona has become a global movement because it reminded people of something they already knew but had perhaps forgotten: that democracy depends on citizens who are willing to do more than just vote, who are willing to pay attention, to ask questions, to insist on accountability even when it's inconvenient. Danny Hartley died believing that no one would ever listen to what he had to say. Today, his story is taught in schools around the world, his name is carved into memorials in dozens of countries, and his legacy has helped create institutions that protect other whistleblowers from suffering his fate. That transformation didn't happen because of politics or policies. It happened because ordinary people chose to take his story seriously and to act on the belief that truth matters. I hope that 25 years from now, when others are honored for their service to truth and accountability, they will remember that their courage began with a simple choice: the choice to care about things that are bigger than themselves, to preserve stories that need to be told, and to trust that individual actions can indeed change the world. 30 years after the discovery, Sarah Martinez died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 64, still living in the apartment above her garage in Millbrook, Arizona. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people from around the world: veterans, journalists, activists, government officials, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her story. Thomas Hartley, now 93 and the last direct connection to Danny's story, delivered the eulogy. Sarah used to say that she was just a mechanic who happened to find some old documents. But I think she understood better than anyone that there's no such thing as just a mechanic, or just a citizen, or just an ordinary person. There are only people who choose to pay attention and people who choose to look away, people who care about truth and people who are content with convenience. My brother Danny died trying to tell a story that no one wanted to hear. Sarah lived to make sure that story was finally heard by everyone who needed to hear it. Together, they proved that the truth really is like water. No matter how many barriers you put in its way, it will eventually find a path to the surface. Sarah once told me that every motorcycle that came into her garage carried stories that deserve to be preserved and respected. I think the same thing is true about every person who passes through our lives. We all carry stories that matter, evidence of experiences that could help others understand important truths about the world we share. The question is whether we'll have the courage to share those stories when the time comes, and whether we'll have the wisdom to listen when others are trying to share theirs. Sarah showed us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to take seriously the evidence that life places in their hands. Danny's story began with a young soldier's decision to document what he believed to be the truth. It continued with a brother's decision to preserve his memory. It was revealed through a mechanic's decision to take seriously some old documents she found hidden in a motorcycle frame. And it will continue through each of us, as we decide whether to pass on the stories that need to be told and whether to listen to the stories that need to be heard.